At BriteCore, we originally adopted remote work years ago in order to access a larger talent pool. Our company has been growing and scaling rapidly for a long time, and we recognized years ago that the top talent in the world was unlikely to live within 20 or 30 minutes of our home office. So we expanded our job searches to begin including national level talent and then ultimately international talent. We additionally had a thesis that moving to remote work would enforce better discipline and tracking across our company. And I'm delighted to report that years later, we have an extremely strong team. We have the top talent in the world, and I have tremendous access to every corner of my company because we've had to become very explicit in our expectations, communication, and tracking mechanisms. We've seen many benefits at BriteCore from moving to remote work. Number one, our team is much stronger. We are an extremely high quality, high talent team because we source from such a large pool of candidates every time we go to hire. We're able to find dramatically better candidates and high performers who have all entered our organization. And over time, that has really produced an effect where the bar has continually raised inside of BriteCore. It's also produced a team that's more resilient. Through this COVID-19 outbreak and the subsequent quarantine, most of the world is struggling and panicking, trying to figure out how do we adjust our work styles. And we've been doing this fully remote thing for a long time. So we're able to ride through an event like this with very minimal impact to operations. It's also forced much more intentional internal communication. If you have people who are spread out across various time zones and maybe your meetings aren't always going to be synchronous at the same time, you have to be much more intentional about what you want to communicate. You can't just walk into a room and ramble, which I think we would all agree is not an efficient use of anyone's time. So our communication has become much more intentional inside of the company. We've also had to become very explicit with our expectations. So we go through very formal exercises at our company on a quarterly basis, a monthly basis, a weekly basis, where we lay out objectives and set expectations up very, very clearly and say, here are the key results we're going to track. And then finally, we've had to become very, very disciplined with our evaluation of output. So a body at a desk, a butt in a seat doesn't really translate to value. What you're really looking for is output from a team member. And by moving remote, we've been forced to put really explicit tracking mechanisms in place so that today we can see the effect of all of the decisions that we're making. If I make a decision to implement system A versus system B, does my overall output go up or does it go down, or how does my response time? And so the interconnectedness of all of those downstream effects is tremendously positive for us, and it forces a very disciplined, organized, intentional organization that is doing what it's doing on purpose. We faced several challenges when we first adopted remote work. Number one, scheduling. If you're going to have people working in different time zones, all of a sudden you have the issue of, it's 3 hours difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. Once you move international, you can end up where time zones are completely flipped upside down. Workers in India might be 11 a.m. there when it's 11 p.m. here. And so you have to really think through how you're going to set up core working hours and how you're going to push as much communication as possible to asynchronous document-based communication, as opposed to let's all get in a room and talk and talk and talk and talk. Let's instead communicate through some other medium where it's okay to contribute in an asynchronous fashion. We also had to get really good at meeting preparedness, because you can't all sit in a room and just talk. You need to really think about, what am I trying to communicate? Why would I be holding this meeting? Why am I asking these 7 people to sit down and talk to each other? And by being much more prepared, at first we were not equipped to do that well. And we have since gotten very good at that. We always require agendas before meetings, and we always require meeting notes at the end of meetings. We also had to adopt a completely different set of tooling than we were using before. It's really critical that everyone in your team has access to tools like a messaging platform and video conferencing. And you have to make sure that the tools are in place. You have enterprise licenses, you have enough seats, and everyone in your team has been trained and they understand how to use those tools. And that was a big challenge for us. And then finally, we had to really think through how we would build alignment and maintain high morale across the team. So along the alignment, that's when we really went through objectives and key results. We are big fans of John Doerr's Measure What Matters. There are other strategies, but it's an excellent approach to making sure that your team is aligned around very clear objectives. They know exactly what's expected of them, and then they know what key results you're going to measure, and those are all tracked on a dashboard, and you can see what the output is. We also had to really think through morale. Some people kind of went stir crazy being at home. A lot of folks at home with COVID-19 quarantine today are experiencing that for the first time. And so you have to do things, fun things back and forth, team building exercises, online games, things you can do together just to remind each other that you're people and you're a community and you're all in this together. So we definitely had challenges around scheduling, preparedness, tooling, and then alignment and morale. But we found really effective strategies to deal with all of those. The most critical factor to our success adopting remote work was total commitment. It's important that you do not set up a culture of haves, the people who are in the office, and the have-nots, the people that are remote. So when BriteCore went remote, we fortunately had the benefit of several months of preparedness. I know a lot of companies today going through COVID are not, they don't have time to prepare, so they're reacting, and that's definitely its own challenge. But regardless, it's important that the executive team commits to, hey, we're doing this, and this is how we're doing this. So in our particular case, I, as the CEO, spent months preparing the team, and then when it was time to go remote, I sent an email out to everyone and said, hey, I'm turning the lights off in my office at 5 p.m. on Friday. I'm walking out the door, and I'm not coming back, and I didn't. And that forced all important communications and interactions to move to those online virtual forums and tools because I wasn't in the building to have that meeting. And so I think those things are important. I think in a company that's reacting right now to COVID, a way you can do something similar is to communicate to employees that, hey, it is worth the time and the investment to learn these tools and to learn these workflow patterns because we're going to continue to offer this in the future. If people feel like it's a temporary investment, they're not likely to make it. But if they feel like, hey, we're going to continue to have this remote work channel available to us later, they're much more willing to go in and invest. I also think it was really, really important to be willing to adapt your internal practices. There's a lot of inertia sitting behind the way things have always been. If you always had a certain team meeting at 3 o'clock on a Friday in conference room A, everyone's just has it in their workflow and their work pattern. That's what we do, and all sorts of decisions and alignment points and all end up converging into that meeting that just is taken for granted. So instead, it's much better to have everyone sit back and just evaluate all of those internal practices and say, if we're remote now, how does this change? And so, for our purposes, we moved to things like daily stand-up meetings and to regular team dashboards and all sorts of other things that are just different mechanisms, but you have to really watch out for inertia and be willing to and be aggressive about changing your internal practices. You also have to make sure that you're communicating your objectives very, very clearly because you can't lead through a cult of personality the same way. You have to lead through clarity. And so, again, John Doerr, the Measure What Matters book, has an excellent strategy behind it on how to establish very clear guidelines, very clear objectives for here is what our team is here to do. Here's what we're trying to accomplish over the next year, the next quarter, the next week. And so then you need to set up what are the key results that we're going to be tracking and measuring our performance against. And those need to be very, very clear. They need to be a number that everyone can see, or they need to be a true false. They shouldn't be qualitative where there's room to argue about them. They need to be very quantitative. I can absolutely explicitly say we accomplished this objective, we did not accomplish this objective. And your team can work towards that. And the great thing about creating quantitative metrics is you can actually put those things into sort of visualization tools and dashboards and places people can go, and it creates an intuitive sense of whether or not the team is failing or succeeding. And so that's a really, really important alignment decision. And then finally, you have to really adopt a culture of inspecting what you expect. So if you as a leader come through and say, we're going to, for example, in an insurance company, let's say you have the goal for your commercial underwriter to evaluate, 10 applications a day or 20 applications a day or something like that. It's not enough to just say you want that to happen. You need to take the time to put the tracking mechanism in place so that you can inspect what you expect, and you can be certain that your team is in fact producing the output that you are hoping for. And the great thing about moving to remote work is no longer can a butt in a seat, can someone standing up and looking busy in a meeting, can that count as work? So you're somewhat forced to put those tracking systems in place, and I think you'll find that your organization is much better for it. In general, remote work has been a trend that has been growing, and there's been a lot of momentum building behind that movement for the better part of a decade now. The COVID-19 quarantine has suddenly thrust that issue to the front of the national stage, and everyone suddenly is thinking about remote work and how do we do it well. And companies like BriteCore, where we've been doing it for a very long time, it feels very normal to us. But for companies like most insurance companies, where it's frequently been people sitting at gunmetal gray desks and cubicles, it's a huge disruption. What I think will be a surprise to a lot of managers who've been operating teams on premise is that following this event, most of the analysts that I've been listening to and reading, and I think just logically it follows, that it's likely that a lot of these employees will request remote work moving forward. Once they've seen that their job can be done and the tools have been forced on the team, if that's the way that it happened for you, to where you can work remotely, then people start to question, why am I doing this commute every day? Why do I have to sit in this office every day? And so, some teams will go to full remote work, some teams will go to partial remote work, but I think remote work will be a topic that will be very difficult to avoid moving forward. So I think the leaders in every field and in every industry will be those who look at opportunities to adopt that, especially for your sort of your intellectual property workers, people who are doing work that really lends itself to remote work. So obviously your factory worker, that doesn't really translate. If you're an underwriter, you could underwrite policies from home just as well as you could underwrite policies from an office, as long as all the tracking mechanisms are in place and the team building, the culture building is in place. So I think the leaders in our industry, in the insurance field, will be those who really find a way to make it work really well right now and are prepared to offer it to employees moving forward. If you aren't prepared to do that and you sort of, 2 months from today, you come back and you say, nope, everybody back to their desks, everybody doing their thing again, I think we're going to see a significant uptick in churn inside of companies, because a lot of companies are going to move to remote now, and a lot of employees would really like to see that. So I think you need to think about how it's going to impact your workforce moving forward. And my recommendation would be to embrace all the value that it can add to your organization. Put all these things in place. You'll be better off for it. More importantly, you'll attract and retain better talent. Every industry has a different set of tools that are critical to their workflow. And so those peripherals aren't things I'm going to really focus on here. I think it is probably more beneficial to talk through the tools that are common to pretty well all white-collar jobs. There are at least 5 basic value streams that really need to be represented in pretty well any company. And the first one is you need a messaging platform. And so messaging is just a way to send a message to someone else. Email is not that platform. Email is messy, it's noisy, there's a ton of spam. There's not a lot of ways to do discussion threads that link off to other discussion threads. It's very limited. Don't use email as your messaging platform. Instead, adopt something that's an enterprise messaging platform designed for the purpose. Internally, we use a tool called Slack. Slack is excellent. You can set up an unlimited number of channels. You can have things like those animated custom emoji to add nuance to your messages. The search feature in it is incredible. You can always find your messages later. It's really, really excellent. So I recommend Slack as a messaging tool, though there are others. You also need some form of time tracking. You need to know whether people are actually working or not. And internally, we use a tool called Toggle. Now, time tracking could be all time. You could have every employee track all their time, so you know what hours people are logging. Internally, we don't do that because we measure so closely to objectives. We don't need to do that. Instead, we use time tracking for, in our industry, in the software industry, for only time we're going to bill customers, so we can show a really accurate representation of what time was worked on a particular customer item. Your mileage may vary, but generally you're going to need some way to track time for certain employees. Then you're going to need some form of project tracking, regardless of what field you're in. If you're doing a desk job, you're working on some sort of project all the time. You have a throughput, you have work items. Sometimes this is called a workflow system and a task system. That's fine too. Internally, we use a project management suite called Rally. Though there are others. There's Jira, there's Clubhouse, there's Trello. There are all sorts of tools that are designed to let you assign a work item, track some conversation or thread or deliverables around that work item, and promote that work item through stages. So again, we use Rally. You're also going to need a productivity suite. Everyone needs to be able to type documents. You need to be able to set up spreadsheets. You need to be able to give presentations. Again, Google's G Suite is excellent. It does so much more frequently than what the equivalent Microsoft Office product does. And a lot of people don't know that because they haven't looked at it in some time, but it's quite a bit more powerful and does a lot more if you're willing to adopt it. The most critical piece is that all of your documents are always in the cloud. Everyone can collaborate in parallel on the same document. So you don't have any versions of documents on anyone's machine. No one has to email a file to someone else. Someone has to say, well, wait till I'm done making my edits. Everyone can go into the same documents all the time and make the edits concurrently. And it's a vastly superior workflow for a remote distributed team. And then finally, you're going to need some teleconferencing software. So what we use internally is a tool called Zoom, though there are others. There's RingCentral, there's BlueJeans, there's a lot. But you're going to need some way to make sure that everyone can quickly and rapidly be on a video call, looking at each other eye to eye, because again, we're all people, and a lot of times the inflection, the tone of my voice matters for the delivery of my message. So make sure that you have, again, a messaging platform. We recommend Slack. Time tracking, we recommend Toggle. Project tracking, we use Rally. Productivity, highly recommend G Suite. And then finally, teleconferencing, where we use Zoom. Is information security impacted by remote work? Yes, it is. It's really important in a remote work environment because you're no longer behind firewalls trying to protect your data, which by the way is not that secure anyway, because anyone behind the firewall has access to more than they should. And an internal nefarious actor is responsible for most information breaches. So everyone's worried about the hackers, but the hackers aren't the ones that get you. It's your internal employees. So really, it's better to move to a distributed platform anyway, but everyone has to recognize when they're coming underneath a phishing attempt for whatever reason. So right now with the COVID-19 quarantine in place, a lot of people who are not trained to be remote workers are suddenly working remotely, and attackers and hackers are using that opportunity to try to exploit it. So we've seen at BriteCore a huge uptick in the number of phishing attempts. A platform you can use internally, we use a platform called KnowBe4, and it is just some very nice, very packaged security training for your team that says things like, watch out for things like last week, a message was sent from an email address. My email address is phil@britecore.com, and the email was very subtle. It was phil@britecorec.om. So they had moved the period from .com to c.om, and they were able to register that address, and they sent it out to our company, and it looked like it came from me. Fortunately, because our team has been through all the training, people knew to look out for that. But you should put your team through that training, and regardless of whether you're working remote or not, that's just a good thing to do because that attack can come at any point in time. But specifically because there are so many people working remotely and so many people in an unfamiliar environment, hackers are trying to exploit that right now. And so I highly recommend doing some information security training, some compliance training. And again, KnowBe4 is a really great platform to execute on that. I frequently get asked if you can manage employees in a remote environment. Like, how do you do that? If you've been managing in an office all the time, it feels very foreign. I would make the strong argument that you can manage employees much more effectively in a remote environment because it forces you to be so disciplined about setting your objectives, making sure that you have been explicit about your key results, that those are visible in a dashboard somewhere, and that there is a frequent check-in mechanism to go back and evaluate those key results. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to close the feedback loop, where if someone's off pace, off track, off target, you're having that conversation 3 hours after they're off target as opposed to 3 months later when they're off target. And so by becoming very explicit about that, it lets you manage the team far more efficiently. And it does, there are all sorts of trickle down benefits. Things like in an office environment, if you happen to be very loud and charismatic, which I happen to be, I'm able to walk into rooms and frequently get everyone to listen to what I have to say just because I'm loud and charismatic. That doesn't mean that my ideas are better. So frequently your introverts are the most thoughtful people on your team. And by moving to an online forum, you're able to make sure that everyone can be thoughtful and reflective in providing feedback, and the loudest voice in the room doesn't carry the day. So there are a lot of benefits to managing remotely in terms of better tracking, being more explicit, making sure that your extroverts aren't overpowering your introverts. I would argue that it's vastly superior if you get the culture and the tooling right, and those are critical. So for the culture, you have to make sure that you're doing things like beer 30 or coffee breaks in the middle afternoon on video chat. You have to make sure that everyone still understands each other people. That's important. So the culture is very, very important. You have to get the tools. You have to adopt those cloud-first collaborative tools. Without those, everyone will be frustrated. But if you get those two things really right and you fully commit as an organization, I think you'll find that you're far happier with what you're able to see and get and measure from your team than what you were before. A lot of companies have on-premise tools and systems that are, installed in a server closet in the basement somewhere, and they find themselves at a loss for what to do with those systems if they move cloud first. And a lesser known fact that a lot of executives are not aware of is that Amazon Web Services provides all of the server types that are sitting in your server closet in the basement. Those are available in the cloud. You can just go out to Amazon Web Services and spin up a Windows, 2000 server if you want to, and install your old piece of software out there. And now suddenly it's not in your basement anymore. It's out on a server that's being maintained for you, being refreshed, being updated, has much better security than anything you could put on premise, and you can access it from anywhere. So we actually have a division of our company, our platform and DevOps team, that helps our own customers transition some of their workloads out of their basements out into the cloud. And to date, we're 65 customers deep and have never had a customer that didn't come back and say, wow, this is a lot better. So you are probably not chained to that basement the way that you might think that you are, if you're just willing to take those systems and install them on a server out in Amazon as opposed to a server in your basement. When you very first make the transition to remote work, there's a very tactical question on the table about what does each employee actually do in a day? Like, how do they wake up and move forward? And I don't know what to do first, because I used to come in and get coffee in the kitchen, and then I walk down and talk to Janice for 15 minutes. Like, what do I do? My schedule's different. And that's not that difficult to do if you'll just think through it and be very explicit about it. So back to the theme of just being very, very explicit in what you expect. So I think it's very helpful to create like a day in the life of walkthrough. If I'm doing your job, my day looks something like X, Y, or Z. So let's say, for example, you're an underwriter. Perhaps you open up your day by very first thing, scan your email for external messages. Then go to Slack and look for internal messages. Block out 15 to 30 minutes to answer any critical internal messages first thing in the day. Then spend the next hour and a half reviewing inbound applications. Let's say that your target is to get through 3 in the morning. Write that out. At the end of that, go check Slack again and block yourself out 20, 30 minutes to answer internal messages. Then go to lunch and take an hour off. Why do you take an hour off? So you can clear your brain. Those sort of things, being very explicit about those guides, can help your team not sit around and guess. And it sort of helps normal out the various personality types and people who have a tendency to get lost in the details, or people who have a tendency of having a hard time to focus, and just say, look, I would recommend you do it like this. You can manage that very closely, you can manage that very loosely, but the important thing is to provide a guide at all. You need to make sure that you've also updated any explicit expectations in your employee handbook. So for example, at BriteCore, if you're in a service-facing role, facing our customers, it's important that you're available when our customers are open. So your hours are a lot less flexible if you're in that customer-facing capacity. Regardless, whether you're in engineering, whether you're in networking, if you're in security, wherever you are, we have core business hours. Why do you need those? Well, because sometimes we do want to get on video chats, just like this one, and talk. And if we're going to talk, we have to know when people will all be available. So it's important to go through and update your employee handbook there. It's also important that managers frequently check in. At BriteCore, we encourage and largely enforce daily stand-up meetings, meaning that even though we're all remote, working in different time zones, every individual team working together has at least an hour of the day where they all overlap, and it's set up on purpose so that they can have a quick check-in. Everybody gets on a video chat like this and says, hey, what did you do today? What are you going to do today? Did you hit any blockers? Do you need anything from me? And they also, shoot the breeze, ask about each other's kids in those meetings sometimes. The point is to make sure that we're all staying connected and realize each other are people. And then I also think it's important that you enforce downtime. So there's actually a personality type out there that says, when I start working remotely, because I can work all the time, I will. And as a manager, it can be tempting to say, oh, that's great, I'm gonna get more work out of people. Actually, those people just get really burned out, and they start to make a lot of mistakes and they do things they shouldn't be doing. So make sure that you also enforce, just with your managers, going down to your employees, hey, are you taking time off? Are you taking time with your kids? Are you taking time with your family? Did you get outside today? We really try to enforce those things at BriteCore, and we see a lot of benefit from all of those actions. It's really important in a remote environment that you maintain a positive atmosphere and keep morale high in the team. It's really easy for people working alone at home to feel too isolated. So you're going to want to take really active steps to try to promote interaction and team building. So some of the things we do here is we'll do fun times. Sometimes we have teams that'll get online and literally play online games together. Some of the teams, if they're into video games, they'll play video games. Teams that aren't, I'm not into video games, we'll have things where people will get online and play a board game together online. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can do sort of fun activities. I have some folks that send me their guitar videos all the time. I play an instrument, I send that to them. We also do things like coffee breaks in the middle of the day, or beer 30, where at 4:30 on a Friday, we all sit down and have a beer on video chat real quick and just visit with each other. So the point is to make sure that you don't treat your staff like processing units in a giant assembly line. You're still working with people. We're all people. People do good work for people they love and respect. And so you want to do a lot to maintain that culture. And probably the most powerful thing you can do is, whether you're remote or not, every so often you need to get the team together. BriteCore has grown large enough that it's not really pragmatic to get the entire company together. We're too large for that. So we do regional meetings with individual teams where, for example, our policies team will all get together and they'll spend 3 or 4 days together and have a summit and visit and have dinners and laugh and just get to know each other really well. So if you'll do those things, make sure you're doing fun activities, make sure that you have scheduled time to do things like coffee breaks. And then finally, every so often you meet in person, I think you'll find that those will go a long way towards building culture and personal interaction. When you're working from home, sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you don't have childcare. That is most notably true today with the COVID-19 outbreak, because those of us who have nannies or daycares, our nannies aren't able to come over, our daycares are shut down, and so we all have kids at home. And at BriteCore, we've taken some steps to make sure that that's really a supported activity. I myself have a young daughter sitting just outside of this room as I record this video. So you're really looking for things like schedule flexibility. Schedule flexibility is absolutely huge. Give people the opportunity to take their kids on a walk. Don't put people on an 8 to 5 schedule on a remote work environment, and be rigorous about it. There's no real utility in it. So instead, give people the flexibility to go spend time with their kids, make their kids lunch, take them on a walk, play a game with them, do whatever. As long as their total output doesn't take a huge hit, I think that's okay. You also want to promote asynchronous communication where possible. If at any point in time someone becomes solo childcare and the kids start screaming, kids need attention, they need to be fed, they suddenly can't sit on that video call. They can't sit in on that meeting. And so as much as possible, try to move your discussions into forums like a Google Doc or a Slack thread where it's okay for people to make comments and then wait 30 minutes for someone to come back and make another comment. I think you'll find that not only does that promote more engagement across your team, but also promotes more thoughtful input. And so because there's accountability now to what I said, because I wrote it down. So I can't walk into a room, say a bunch of things that are poorly formed or maybe have hostile intentions behind them, and then later deny that I said that. I have to be accountable for my words and my actions and my ideas. And we found that to be a significant positive influence in BriteCore. And by moving to asynchronous communication, you allow your team members who are watching children the flexibility to take care of their children and still participate in the conversation. You also want to make sure you culturally normalize that it's okay to have kids on calls. It's all right for your kids to be screaming and you need to go take care of them, and just bring them in and sit them on your lap and hold them and give them a hug right while you're on that call. Don't let that be an odd thing. Let that be normal. And the way I've done that in my company is when my daughter cries, I go pick her up and I hold her right on a call like this. And that is a way to help everyone feel like it's okay. We understand you're a human. You're a person. You have a family. Your children are there, and we're glad that you're spending time with your kids because we care about you. And that's how you have people really, really love and invest in your company, by showing them you care about them as people. And you should. You should, and you should support that. And it's not that difficult to do. So again, schedule flexibility, asynchronous communication where possible, and culturally normalize that it's okay to have your kids popping their heads into meetings sometimes.